It's no secret, my relationship with Italia is extremely fragile. I spent 2 years living in Italy for my bachelor's degree. When I got an opportunity to move to London to complete my degree, I was all too happy to pack up with the intention to never return unless it was absolutely necessary. The first country I ever visited was in 2003, and it was Switzerland, which is great. I mean, there are few countries that can top Switzerland as the first country you ever travel to. However, being born and raised in Zimbabwe, that kind of warped my perception that the entirety of Europe was like Switzerland. And when I moved to Italy in 2017, I quickly learned that actually it was quite different to Switzerland. And my Italian friends quickly gave me a much needed reality check that if I was going to compare every single thing about Italy to Switzerland, I was in for a miserable time. But while I personally have a very fragile relationship with Italy, I'd like to believe it hasn't clouded my judgment and I'm still able to see the beauty, literally the beauty of Italy. And in this video, I'm going to talk about everything I love about Italy, the culture shock I experienced in Italy, and I'm going to end on a negative note and tell you why I'm not particularly crazy about Italia. Everything I love about Italia. First and foremost, the culture and the language. If you are somebody that is super into the arts, there are few countries that can top Italia. Italian culture is so rich. There are tons of museums, tons of galleries. I am still, like 5 years later, I'm still in disbelief that I literally saw the original David when I was in Florence. You can see pieces from the Renaissance, buildings, the architecture is stunning. It's interesting because I was studying in Venice, and when I would, tell people outside of Italy that I was studying in Venice, they automatically assumed I was studying art history. I feel like even if you haven't been exposed to a lot of the arts, if you find yourself living in Italy, you have no choice but to immerse yourself into Italian arts and Italian history and Italian culture. And I strongly believe that everybody leaves Italy as a more cultured person, and I think that's great. Not to mention the language is so melodic, and it's actually not too difficult to learn, even if you make little to no effort like myself. So one of my friends who was in the same degree program as me, she's from California, she said that even though she had French ancestry and it would have been more ideal for her to learn French, she opted to learn Italian instead because she liked the fact that in Italian you pronounce every letter that you see. So yeah, if you're interested in learning Italian, it is a beautiful language to know. But if you're also somebody who is an aspiring diplomat or aspiring civil servant, which is half my audience on here, I will say it's not a very useful language to know, which is actually the reason why after completing the basics of my Italian language course, I decided to call it quits. But I never regret knowing beautiful sounding words, and actually there are certain words that I just think sound better in Italian, so I rarely ever say them in English. One of those words is because. I'll hardly ever say the word because, I'll always say perché. Case in point, did you hear that word? Like it added something extra. It is a beautiful country if I ever saw one. So I remember being interviewed by, I think it was the Venice Diplomatic Society or the university, one of the two. One of the questions was to kind of draw on comparisons from my country, Zimbabwe, and Italy. The first thing I could mention was that both countries are extremely beautiful, even though they're very different in terms of landscape. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and tell you that Italy is not one of the most beautiful countries I've ever visited. I mean, there's a reason why during the summertime, the Amalfi Coast, Positano, Napoli are all, top like celebrity tourist destinations and vacation spots. Oftentimes when I'm recounting my experience to friends here in Zimbabwe, I'm often met with the response, "Oh my goodness, that's kind of disappointing to hear. I've always wanted to visit." And hopefully I'm able to sell it in this video, but I never want to stop anyone from visiting. I actually think it's definitely a country that should be on your bucket list. I just don't think, if you look anything like me, I just don't think it's the best idea to actually live there. The food is everything you imagine it to be. It's so interesting because long before I even knew that I would end up in Italy, Italian food was always my favorite cuisine. There's not a thing I wouldn't do for pasta. Pasta has been my favorite food since I was a child, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Despite the fact that while I was in Italy, I like almost ate it at least 5 times a week. This is the point I'm trying to make. Italian cuisine is quintessentially like the Mediterranean diet, which studies have, time and time again shown us how healthy the Mediterranean diet is. But even in that time, having access to pizza and pasta like at my disposal, I still feel like it was one of the healthiest eras of my life. I also want to mention, I feel like we know about how good Italian tomatoes are, we know about pizza, we know about pasta, we know about gelato. But one thing that really just blew my mind when I was there that I don't think is spoken about too often is how good the yogurt is. I really need people to start talking about how amazing yogurt in Italy is. I remember it was actually when I discovered my love for vanilla flavored yogurt, and I remember my favorite brand there wasn't even like a bougie expensive bio brand. It was actually like, so there's a supermarket in Italy called Conad, and it was the Conad's brand of vanilla yogurt, and I just it's the best thing ever, and there's not a day that I don't miss that yogurt. The transportation system. So I remember in the same interview that I just mentioned, I also mentioned how much I loved the transportation system, and I got a lot of responses from my Italian friends who were obviously wondering what exactly it was that I liked about the transportation system, which is notorious for striking and for delays. As you will notice with this entire video, it is subjective. This is as told by Lamia. I'm giving you my own subjective opinion. And coming from a country like Zimbabwe, where our public transportation system leaves much to be desired, I fully abused the buses, trains, boats, trams when I was in Italy, because I just love the idea that, albeit the strikes and the delays, there was a system in place that could get you from A to B. If you ever visit Italy, you have to take the Frecciarossa, which directly translated means red arrow, if I'm not mistaken. And it is a super fast train. You will pay extra for it because of how quickly it can get you to your destination, but you don't even feel the speed. Like, it just feels like you're gliding through air, and it's a premium experience. Highly recommend. This kind of relates to culture, but I also love how familial the culture is in Italy. Coming from a society which is also extremely communal and family is everything in the country where I come from, it was really, really nice for me to find myself in a country that equally values family. It's not uncommon in Italy to be walking in the streets and you see literally an entire family, from the grandparents down to like the grandchildren. And in the summertime, it's so beautiful because like evening walks are a thing. It's not uncommon to see like an entire family eating gelato, walking the streets of Roma. It's something that I really appreciated. Granted, if you're studying there, it reminds you of how alone you are and how far you are from your family, but it's still something really beautiful to see. Especially because straight after living in Italy, I moved to London, which I think is a little bit more individualistic. The culture shock, Northerners versus Southerners. This was definitely something that was interesting to me, especially because I had no idea this was the case. I mean, I'd just come out of doing A-level history, in which I learned about the unification of Italy. Keyword unification. Come to find out, like several centuries later, I don't know if I've got those dates correct, that there's still a little bit of division between Northerners and Southerners. That was interesting to me. I mean, I remember even within my degree program, one of my classmates, if they were referencing him and let's say somebody didn't know his name, they would just be like, oh, the guy from the South. And everyone would be like, oh yeah, I know the one, go on. Unfortunately, I didn't get to travel to the South, but I would have loved to. This is a generalization, but all the Southern Italians I met were really lovely. Bold proclamation here, but I think that in the South they are a little bit more hospitable. Hopefully I'll get the opportunity to visit Naples soon and report back to you on that. Another culture shock was that tea is definitely not a thing in Italy. So I don't drink coffee at all, not because I think I'm better than anyone, but simply because I have a really low caffeine tolerance and I don't like the taste. It's bitter. You guys are lying about that. I don't know if you can like something that tastes bitter that much. I recently heard somebody say that coffee is to Italy what tea is to England, and I can kind of confirm, having lived in both countries. However, in England, it's not like you wouldn't find coffee anywhere. It would still be available. But on the other hand, in Italy, ordering tea is really seen as something very extra. I remember at one of the universities I attended, I would obviously get tea every day, and not only was it really really expensive anywhere you went. It was also kind of made into like an entire ceremony. So as opposed to just getting, a mug with a tea bag, they'd bring out this really fancy like porcelain teapot. Also, as somebody who doesn't drink alcohol, my options were extremely limited in terms of beverages in Italy. I had tea if I was willing to, get everyone to like try and go back into the storeroom to even see if they had English breakfast tea, or I had like a peach iced tea. La moda. Wearing a hoodie outside in Italy, like outside of your house, is practically a sin. I remember the one time I had worn my university hoodie to class, and several of my Italian classmates came up to me to ask if I was feeling unwell or under the weather, to which I replied, I feel fine. Why do you ask? Their response was, you're wearing a sweater, so we assume that you're not feeling up to it today. And I remember how funny this was to me, that I remember like a few months later when I met another Italian lady and she was asking me, what have you found different? And I was recounting this story, and I couldn't even get to the end of the story before she interrupted me to say, wait, you mean to say that you wore your hoodie outside, like to the supermarket? And I was like, yeah, and also to class. And she had heard enough. She said, we don't do that. She said, grab yourself a sweater or like a cardigan, like don't wear your hoodie outside. Everybody is dressed incredibly well. You need to find it in you to be confident within yourself, because you'll 9 times out of 10 be underdressed compared to everybody else. I remember when I was at this university, Venice International University, which is like a consortium of at the time 16 different universities. So the institution had Italian partners, but they also had American partners. The juxtaposition of sitting in a classroom with American students who were quite literally coming to class in their pajamas and Italian students who were straight off the Milan Fashion Week runway was an interesting thing to experience, I'll say that much. Certain foods are just not a thing in Italy, or specifically in Venice. There are certain foods, having been raised in Zimbabwe, that I thought you would find anywhere you are in the world. For example, baked beans, like a commodity, a staple. Except in Venice, I actually ended up having to, every time I would like visit somewhere else, another European country, I'd actually like come back with like cans and cans and cans of baked beans. And I remember this was so interesting. The one time when I was going through customs, my bag kind of beeped. The customs officer asked me if he could open my bag. I said, of course. And here, of course, he sees the entire shelf of baked beans. He kind of gave me a look like, why would you, like, of all the things you could take from Geneva, why baked beans? Like, we have cheese, we have chocolates. I was like, is everything okay? And he was like, yeah, it's all good. But it was so interesting. And if I would run out of baked beans, which of course was the case oftentimes, I would actually resort to making my own baked beans. Some of you have never had to make your own baked beans, and it shows. Another thing that I couldn't find, which, growing up in Zimbabwe was very accessible and almost also seen as a commodity, but this one was less of a shock to me because I'd visited other European countries where this was also the case, was hot chocolate. So in Italy, if you ask for hot chocolate, it's 9 times out of 10 going to be the really thick hot chocolate, which is almost like melted Lindt chocolate. It's extremely rich and unfortunately not for me. I would prefer the British version of hot chocolate, which is literally like chocolate powder and like 3/4 of milk and like 1/4 of water. I remember even traveling with my friends to Morocco, and during our early morning flight, it kind of hit me that I was on my way back to Italy. So at 3 in the morning, I decided that I had to walk around this airport to get myself a hot chocolate before I returned to Italia, where I knew I was not going to be guaranteed any hot chocolate the way it should be done, in my opinion. Another food that isn't that common in Italy is like regular cereals. So like your Cocoa Pops, your Smacks, your Rice Krispies. These are not things that you're regularly gonna find in Italy, at least in Venice. The cereal aisle is, no more than a few shelves. And when I went grocery shopping for the first time, I was like, surely I'm missing something. And I literally paced around that supermarket like at least 3 times before, asking one of the supermarket assistants, like, do you have cereal? And he's like, of course we have cereal. And then he brought me like muesli, and I was like, not the healthy stuff. Like, do you have like Cocoa Pops or something? And actually no. So you might be wondering, what do kids eat for breakfast? I was on a quest to find out the same thing. I think it's usually like, biscuits or like tarts or orange juice and like a brioche. Cereal is not that big of a culture in Italy, and I guess that kind of ties into how healthy the Mediterranean diet is, because they said respectfully, no, we will not be eating like so much sugar early in the morning. Moving on to the juicy part of this video, why I'm not particularly crazy about Italia. So if you've seen my video on my experience doing everything humanly possible to leave Italy to spend my final year in London, you might recall that the main push factors for me were racism and discrimination. I need to mention again that I'm Zimbabwean. I've attended multi-racial schools my entire life, so I know racism and discrimination and I are very well acquainted. But I have to say that Italy takes it to a whole new level. I had numerous incidents of blatant racism and of course everyday microaggressions that I soon became immune to, and it's never surprising to me when I come across videos on my For You page or YouTube videos of people of color talking about experiencing racism in Italy. In fact, I remember the one time I was dashing off to school and I walked past a group of like Somalis and I kind of smiled at them. We had this nice little interaction and then they stopped me and they're like, "Are you Somali?" And anyway, I explained my whole ancestry to them and they were like, "What are you doing here?" Because of course I didn't look like a tourist. I was quite literally on my way to class. Don't worry, I wasn't wearing a hoodie. I learned my lesson. I told them, no, I live here. They're like, "How long have you been living here?" And at that time, it was coming on the 2-year mark. I was actually a few weeks shy of leaving. I felt so seen because the first thing they said to me was, "How? We literally arrived this morning. We've been here all of 3 hours and it's already been really bad. We don't know how you've done it for 2 years." Of course, I then shared my very exciting news with them that I was moving to their city, London. I was once in this terrible apartment situation. So like the girls that I was living with, my actual flatmates, if I saw them on like the island and we were like walking towards one another, they would actually switch sides and just like not acknowledge me. And I remember it was just comedic, for lack of a better word, because the one time there was an event with one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter organization and she was coming to speak at my university. I decided to pop in for 10 minutes before dashing off to a class that I had, and lo and behold, you guys will not believe who I saw at this event. It was my flatmates. And I remember when we locked eyes, they looked a bit embarrassed, which is enough for me to know that they were aware that they were being a little bit hypocritical there. There's no better explanation I can give you of how incredibly tough it was for somebody, and I'd like to consider myself a pretty tough person. I think I'm quite resilient and I will put everything else on the back burner in pursuit of a quality education. But I think even for someone like me, my 2 options were either dropping out or leaving, and you can hear how much of an uphill battle leaving was in my video on how I got to UCL. I don't know if anything has got better on that front since I left Italy, but unfortunately I won't hold my breath. In fact, a few months ago I thought it was quite interesting how there was an open conversation about how Kabi, I think he's still the world's most followed TikToker, was granted Italian citizenship. And it was interesting that the narrative was everybody celebrating that he got Italian citizenship, but I really wish the conversation was steered in the direction of why is it that somebody who has spent the majority of their life in Italy was only just granted Italian citizenship after reaching worldwide stardom. I would pay a lot of money to watch a documentary where Kabi talks about his life in Italy pre-fame and post-fame. In fact, if Ava DuVernay doesn't want to do it, I will direct this movie myself. If you are somebody that is considering studying in Italy because you are drawn by the extremely affordable tuition fees, will say that I totally understand, and my experience might not be your experience, but in the same breath, I think it is my responsibility to advise you as best as I can, because I don't wish what I experienced on my worst enemy. I will say that if you must go to Italy as a person of color to study, I think you should particularly look at Milan, Florence and Rome, which are more cosmopolitan, and every time I visited Milan I felt a lot more comfortable. Every time I visited Florence I also felt a lot more comfortable. Then Venice, which is situated in the Veneto region, which is also the most conservative region in Italy. So I hope I haven't killed your Italian study abroad dreams, but I hope I've actually just directed you to a city where you might feel a little bit more comfortable. This kind of ties into my previous point, and it's an apt time to make a much needed disclaimer that again, this video is entirely subjective. These are my opinions as somebody who's quite reflective, and that is that I found Italy generalized to be quite close-minded. It goes without saying that this is a huge generalization, and I'm not meaning every single Italian that I've met is close-minded, but it was really interesting to me to find myself in a country where hospitality isn't really the order of the day. I'd like to think, and I hope nobody can prove me wrong on this, I think Zimbabweans are incredibly hospitable. Again, as I mentioned already, I'd like to think that maybe in the south this would be different. I remember after my first year of university, when I returned to Zimbabwe, I actually thought that I wasn't making that much of an effort because I realized how few Italian friends I had. And so returning for my second year, I went with a vengeance. I was so determined to, have more Italian friends. But I quickly realized into my second year that I was not the problem. And actually there was a reason why all the international students in my degree program stuck together. And I think it's particularly disappointing to me as an idealistic person, because I do need to mention that the program I was studying was very international in its nature. It was philosophy, politics, and economics, something that demands you to be a little bit more open-minded. But unfortunately, I had several occasions where I'd be, sitting down for class, and all of a sudden the person I randomly decided to sit next to was like packing up and like moving to the other end of the classroom. And it was a little bit disappointing to me that people who are studying, international relations would be this rigid. As you can imagine, finding accommodation as an international student in Italy, but I'm going to say specifically in Venice, is very difficult. In fact, on a few occasions I was straight up told, we're not accepting your request because having a non-Italian will ruin the dynamic of the house. And they saw nothing wrong with that, which I think was the worst part. And then my final point on why I'm not crazy about Italia is bureaucracy is a nightmare for everyone in Italy, even Italians. But can you imagine what it's like if you're an international student from a global south country? It's actually the worst. Everybody I know has PTSD from just doing simple bureaucratic things. I feel like Italian bureaucrats love nothing more than telling you that you don't have the right documentation and sending you back. Like you're not wasting your time or your money, and it's very frustrating. All the paperwork I had to do in Italy took years off of my life, and I'd like to think that I'm a relatively calm person. I'm quite slow to anger, but even for me, there was one occasion where I actually just lost it, and I'm not proud, but the unfortunate thing is that blowing up and getting really angry actually got the job done. It actually made them a bit more understanding, and they made a plan. I think everybody who is a foreigner in Italy has terrible experiences with the questura. It's just not the place where you want to do paperwork. It's incredibly dehumanizing. You're pretty much left with little to no dignity. I really hope you guys have enjoyed me recounting my Italian experience. Because I left this video on a negative note, I do want to remind you that I recommend that everybody and their mom visits Italy at least once in their lives, because everybody needs Italian yogurt and gelato in their lives, and I think it's best to see the Leaning Tower of Pisa in person. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.